All right, it is definitely time to pour some wine. Hey, June, did you get a chance to watch last week's? Because we missed you.
I watched a little bit of it.
Okay.
Yeah, but I didn't get through the whole thing yet.
Okay.
I will.
Are you gonna get mad if Cheryl's drinking one of Co's shards?
No, even if I was, I would say it, so it's fine.
I hope not.
No, you can drink Coast wine. That's fine. As long as you're drinking wine from Sunnyside or the DeGrol Vineyard, you're good to go.
We figured it's in the family, so.
Pretty much.
Yeah. So what's everybody else drinking? Does everybody have, well, we have Coast Shard, we have water.
Train station.
All right.
Love
Oh,
that.
you can't see this.
Train.
2011 Carriage House.
Oh,
Yeah.
good.
Because Adrish doesn't have any train stations, so he's just sucking it up with train.
It's a hard life. What can I say?
Mike, you're on task. I like
Mike,
that.
Mike's got it.
He's got the cab.
Okay, close.
Gus
Fine.
drinking scotch is my guess. As usual.
Jim's got it, I'm sure.
So, Jim, what do you have? We're not getting it.
I have train station.
Perfect. I like it.
You're not hearing that? Can you
Yeah.
hear now?
Now I do. Yep.
Yeah. 2016.
There you go.
Fantastic. Perfect.
Natalie, coming in.
Natalie, how you doing, Natalie? So I'm excited. We got a bunch of people, and which is going to be fun because Adrish entertains himself, and in doing so, he entertains everybody else.
I mean, that's really the goal. I got to entertain myself. And if in so doing, other people are entertained, well.
Spread it around.
And that's really how you get a chance to work Harvest is you have to be able to entertain us. Because otherwise, I don't know, by the time we get you trained up and leave. So it's got to be worth the entertainment value. So, all right. Well, should we give people more than 503 Coke? Hey, I like that. You see that, Micah? Co's drinking Côte Bonneville.
Train station.
So while we're on the train station, and since it got brought up, Adrish, you want to talk about your background for a second? Where are you?
Oh, yeah, I'm actually in the train station. And if I move this way, you'll see a bottle of the train station. I think this might have been the October birthday thing we did last harvest, actually.
It was.
Yeah.
I recognize the lineup and the cider and Josh in the background.
Exactly. I was gonna say, and that's Josh and Kathy in the background, so that must be what it is. And then there's the I can't figure out where I'm pointing, the Bale Breaker can.
Yeah. So everybody, there's a lot of birthdays and Co's anniversary, and that all happen in October. And during the harvest, you don't get your own day. That'd be greedy, and it doesn't often work that way. So Dad started coordinating the one day where everybody who's got an October birthday, anniversary, something, whatever you want to celebrate in October, we have one day for it. And it's turned into a really fun party. And so, including Dad, he has to organize his own birthday party.
But he gets a really good cake out of it. So
Yeah, he gets, and they do barbecue every year and really good cake, and it's super fun. So the train station is, we talked about train station a couple, 3, 4, can't even remember, weeks ago, but it's, the wine is really about occasions like that. There's a bunch of people. We have the Sheffield cider at that party because we have people who don't even drink wine. So train stations are great. It's a great mix of, I want to drink something that I like, but it's not the right time to open necessarily. I'm not drinking with the people who are going to appreciate something like Cote. So and also with the screw cap, it's really easy to get into. So, and I always tell myself that if I drink out of a screw cap, this is how I end up drinking Co's wines a lot. Cause I'm like, I want something good. I want something with a screw cap, cause then I can just have one glass. And I won't tell you how often that actually happens, but the theory is really good. So I open Train Station, I open Co's wines a lot when I kid myself that I'm just gonna have a glass. So that's great for that. The
How big is
Cabernet,
the one glass? How big is the one glass?
Well, I actually have glasses that hold an entire bottle, but
It's like the Ina Garden, I'm going to drink one Cosmopolitan.
Yeah.
yeah. Oh, I did not know Corbin made a screw cap adapter. That's cool. I still, there's no point though, Co. I still am gonna open a bottle of your wine and drink the whole freaking thing. So, you know, whatever. But I mean, that's my problem with Corbin in general. Like, I guess you could, but not the way I
Well, who
enjoy
would?
wine.
Seems like a waste.
I know. So we started the Train Station brand with the Cabernet, the label with the Cabernet, and we do make the Cab every year. This is the first year we've done the red blend, and we have a fun game planned because one of the things for Adrish, because one of the things we did last year was we have a bunch of pictures that Andrea Johnson has taken over the years, and she's going to be here next week. But we have them playing on the loop in the train station, and Adrish would always be like, I don't know where that is. I don't know where that is. It's like, you've been up in the vineyard like every day for 2 weeks. You got to figure out where you're at. So we're going to play the little game of where in the vineyard, Dad's cracking up, where in the vineyard does this come from? So I'm going to put the picture up of the vineyard, and Adrish is going
Oh, you got to help me out here.
I got to help you out.
No,
What?
Co.
Go. Hey, you're on your own, buddy.
You're on your own. So, Train Station Red Blend is a mix of Cabernet, Merlot, and Syrah. Where's the Syrah in this picture?
The Syrah is all the way, from the way that I'm looking at it, top left corner, kind of on that downslope.
Right here?
Yeah.
Excellent. Good job, sir. Wonderful. All right. Where's the Cabernet?
Isn't it all on the hill?
Where on the hill?
Where on the hill?
Oh, like, I mean, it covers most of the hill, and then and then all the way, basically starting from the like short rows on the right, and then all the way sort of maybe 3/4 of the way across.
Starting from the short rows.
Yeah, and
And
then
going
going to your left.
this way.
Yeah,
Tell me when to stop.
somewhere there, right there.
Kind of.
Okay.
You are correct that this block is Cabernet. It goes all the way to the road is Cabernet.
Okay.
And above that road.
And below this road, is that Cabernet or not?
Below this road.
You're cheating.
I think that is Merlot.
Good answer.
Good.
All right. So where else would we find Cabernet?
Over on the other side of the road, or of the to your right.
Tell me when to stop.
Like all of this section, yeah, exactly. So all of that section, except for you've got Cab Franc all the way in a few of the rows on the left, but the rest of it is
Down here.
Cabernet. Yeah.
Fantastic. That is a gold star for you. Woo. And so Saying cheers. You passed the test. Good
Oh,
job.
okay. Thank you. Whew. Wait. Okay. That was it. We're done.
That was, well, Dad has something to say.
Oh.
Yes, sir.
You might point out, for those that weren't aware of it, that Adrish was with us for a couple weeks last harvest, so he could learn what goes on, what all this talk about is crush, that it's really, you crush the winemakers, not just the grapes.
We try not to.
Okay.
I love this. Yes, that's why the last couple of years we've had a little bit of help, because we've decided that crushing the winemaker is really overrated. So we're aiming to just crush grapes and not the people. So it was wonderful that Adrish could come help us out last year. So, and that was one of the things we found out, is how well Indian food goes with these wines. And so he came up with the food pairing. So Adrish, you want to talk to us about your kebabs?
I mean, yeah, I think kebabs in general are a pretty standard kind of dish in northern India. I mean, I think the great thing about chicken kebabs is that I think they're super easy to make. They're super flavorful if you marinate them.
36 hours.
For maybe not 36 hours, but if you marinate them overnight, they certainly absorb a lot of the flavors in the marinade really well, and you end up with something that's really tasty, really juicy, not too dry, but still really good. And I think the other thing about chicken kebabs that I just like, I mean, they're really easy to make, and you can make them on the grill, you can bake them in the oven, you can throw them on a grill pan and on the stovetop. You can eat them as is. You can eat them with rice. There's a lot of different ways to play with it. And frankly, I mean, it doesn't have to be chicken. You can play around with beef or lamb. If you're like vegetarian, you can do like tofu or paneer. You can add vegetables, pretty much any vegetable you grill with. So it's a simple but pretty versatile recipe, and I think all the spices that go into it, they really pair incredibly well with red wines. But I think the 2012 Carriage House is what we discovered paired like really, really well when we tried it last time.
This is pairing well too, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, great. Yeah. I was actually saying on Sunday, which is when I made my test batch, that I was drinking it with the 2011 Carriage House, and the 11 is almost too subtle. So I think the 12, which is I guess more like the train station, probably pair a lot better.
Yeah. Hey Becky, did you make this? Since it looks like you're chewing, we won't ask you to say anything. But
yeah, no, I didn't have enough time today with work and all, so
okay.
I made a much simpler, just got some naan and put some garlic on it.
So you're in the Indian theme. I like that.
Mm.
Oh, good.
Did anybody make it?
Yeah, Mike and Sue did.
Good.
Fantastic. Thumbs up. Got a thumbs up from cheer.
This is a fun thing to make with kids or grandkids too, because they love to be helping, and it's easy. So I do kebabs a lot with the grandkids.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yep. So, okay, since we did our vineyard quiz, I'm going to unmute Dad, and we'll hear what's going on in the vineyard. Go ahead. You're good, Dad.
Okay, so which one of the pictures do you want to show?
I've got all three of them.
That's the Syrah, I believe.
That's the Cabernet.
Okay, so for those of you who've been tracking with us, you remember 6 weeks ago, these vines were dormant. There was bud swell. And so since then, we've had growth We, in this particular picture over on the left, is what we shoot thinned last week and did not shoot thin the rest of the vine. And what you see in the right-hand grouping on the same, the arm of the vine that comes out is called the cordon. There was a question that came up, what's a cordon? And so the stuff that's got bark on it is on the main wire going horizontally, that's the cordon. And then the next position on the cordon, there is more fruitfulness. And you can see, let's see, Carrie, I think you can point out some of those clusters.
Oops.
Yeah. And Syrah clusters are longer than Cabernet. And so what you're seeing is a variance. The position that we started with did not have the fruitfulness, the adjacent position did. And so it all averages out, but you get to see that not everything is stamped out.
Yeah.
Okay, then what's the next one?
This guy, well, here, this guy is the only cluster on that first outermost shoot. So there's a couple of shoots there, but only one of them has a cluster, and there's only one cluster. So that's not as exciting as this next position over, which has a cluster here and a cluster here and a cluster. I think there was a cluster back here. So there's a lot more fruit on that next one over. And then we go to the Syrah.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry, that was Cabernet Sauvignon. So Syrah grows differently. What you see is the again, the next position over has a dominant shoot that comes up and swings over to the left. That's got more fruit on it. The position that we thinned last week is ahead of it. And you can see that the vineyard behind it has uniform growth throughout. This spring, all the vines are happy. They came into it dry. We've been watching the watering regimen to be sure they get their sips, and they've been responding very well. And then there's one more picture that Carrie has.
I didn't bring it up.
Oh, okay. For the past 10 days, we've had a lot of wind events. And so the wind beats these tender shoots up and tears them off, especially the longer ones. And so there's been a significant natural thinning of shoots by the wind episodes that we've had in the past week.
I put that one on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter Monday, I think. So you can go back and look at that one. But
Okay.
Yep.
Oh, so the other thing is the noteworthy dates that we look for in the vineyard are typically in our vineyard, April the 6th is bud break. If you remember, Jonathan said that in Red Willow, it's tax time, April 15th, and Marshall is kind of in between. And then the next event that we look for is Bloom, which is typically June the 6th. And so we're developing things, trying to keep everything healthy with that next date as a big start event on the calendar.
So Jim, to answer your question about the shoot, if it was allowed to keep growing, the way that the vines start, you've got it looks like this green growing shoot is what a young vine looks like from, in our case, when it's own rooted, it comes up like that the first year. And that becomes, one of those becomes the trunk and becomes the cordon. And then every subsequent year, they get, like throughout the growing season, at the end of the growing season, they will lignify and form, they harden. You can see, whoops, let me try to do this without flipping. You can see this area right here that's browner and harder. That was last year's shoot. So they do lignify by the end of the season. And then every year as they get older, they get thicker. And similar to a tree, you can tell if it had they grow faster, and like with the tree, there's more spacing in the rings if they get a lot of water and sunlight, so they grow faster. And in conditions where they grow more slowly, the rings are closer together. And that's the same in grapevines. If they're older but growing quickly with a lot of water and nutrients, then you get those really fat trunks. If they're, even like in the case of a Riesling, where they're older, it's so rocky and they don't have much water, it's like a very old skinny tree because those rings are really close together. So our Riesling vines, even though they're old, they're not that big around. So some people will say you can tell the age of a vine by how big it is, and that's not true. But they do continue to grow out every year.
Okay, thank you.
Of course. All right. So, what'd you say, Dad?
Mute.
Mute. I'm glad you're entertaining yourself. That's Dad's new sign. So, since we talked about vineyard, now we're going to go into harvest, because harvest is really it's an interesting time for all sorts of reasons. It is the end of the growing. Oh, hey, Marshall. It's the end of the growing season, and so we spend all of this time working on growing grapes. And if you guys haven't been tuning into the virtual vineyard series, Marshall is going to talk to us about growing grapes on Red Mountain tomorrow. So, and he's got all sorts of pictures that he's going to show. And so by the time you work really hard in the vineyard and you take all this, and you grow grapes, and then you're just about to be ready and done for the season and take a nap, is when in the winery you're really ramping up and working hard, and as Dad said, crushing your winemakers. So I thought it'd be fun to hear Adrish's take on the on harvest, because my take on harvest at the beginning, like Chardonnay is usually the first thing we pick, and it's every year picking Chardonnay is like Christmas morning. It's absolutely my favorite, and we get to Halloween and the end of the Cabernet, and I'm like over it, and I'm done, and I'm ready to move on with the rest of the year. And so as such, and there's all the ups and downs in the middle, and it's really hard for me to figure out how to talk about harvest in one meeting. I mean, there's just so much stuff. So Adrish is very good at synthesizing information, and he skipped Chardonnay. Sorry, you have to come back. You get to do that this year. And so we're going to let him talk about his first harvest experience. And you should probably give us a little bit of your background as well, since not everybody knows you as well as.
And why you're interested in the harvest and.
Yeah. No, yeah, absolutely. So I think, so first of all, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Adrish. My association with Côte Bonneville and with Carrie and sort of Kathy and Hugh and everybody actually goes back a pretty long ways, all the way to our Northwestern days. So I've been coming to Sunnyside for, I want to say, almost 20 years now. I think my first trip out to Sunnyside was for the launch of the winery, which was 2002.
Mm-hmm.
Two, yeah. So I mean, I didn't come to harvest, or I didn't come to any of this through sort of, the wine route. Like I know nothing about wine. I'm not a wine geek. I'm not a winemaking expert. None of that. I just happen to spend a lot of time in Sunnyside, and so my take on this is less from just a wine perspective. It's more from the perspective of so I'm a consultant by profession. I've been a consultant for 12 plus years, sort of advising clients on lots of operational topics and strategy topics and things like that. And that sort of I've observed into companies and industries across a lot of different industries, sort of and we constantly sort of thinking about, okay, how do we make things, why do they do things a certain way, what makes them successful, how do you make things more efficient, how do you continue to improve things, what makes a company kind of a business successful. So that's, I think, more of the lens that I have when I'm looking at this. and as luck would have it, I decided to quit my job in sort of July of last year, and I thought, well, this basically presents a great opportunity for me to, instead of just spending a weekend like I usually do in August at the pre-harvest party, walking the vineyard for a couple of hours and then basically drinking a lot of wine. I figured this would be a great opportunity to spend sort of 2 weeks actually sort of observe and follow, a part of the process in more detail than I do in 2 days. I also have sort of just an interest and a passion for food and food systems. And so being, in the Yakima Valley, which is obviously an agricultural region in the middle of harvest, also then, meant that I was able to talk to and meet with and see a lot of other crops being harvested as well, which is also super cool. So, I mean, that's the sort of lens, and those are sort of things that I kind of want to talk about. So with that, let me maybe jump in. So I guess the first question, and thanks Micah for asking this question, but so the first question is, so what did I actually do, right? And I think the what I did while I was there for 2 weeks was really kind of get a view of, you guys did a really great job of making sure I got a glimpse of all of the different steps in the process, more than, I would in a weekend. So kind of the first thing I did was go pick, harvest grapes in the vineyard. Hugh sort of, told me what to pick, how to pick, how to select. There's a lot of selection that goes into it. I asked stupid questions like, why don't we pick grapes with sunburn? And then you kind of looked at me and said, why don't you taste the grape and find out? And I tasted it, and it tasted absolutely awful. And I was like, okay, this makes sense. So I spent a very little bit of time in the vineyard, because pretty quickly we realized that I was wildly inefficient and about, a quarter as fast as the vineyard crew who was actually trained to do this. And so so I spent, I don't know, maybe like an hour or two picking in the vineyard, and then sort of moved on to other parts of the process. So the next thing was really picking and sorting the grapes as they came, out of the vineyard onto a conveyor, into and crushed, which I don't have a picture of. But then I think the other thing that I spent a lot of time doing every day, which is sort of like my standard task every day, was something called a punch down. And
twice a day. Don't sell yourself short. You did it twice a day.
Twice a day, sorry. And punch downs are also special because, can you guys hear this? They come with a soundtrack. Punch downs were always with Jimmy Buffett playing in the background. And I have to say, after 2 weeks, I was ready to listen to something else. But it was.
There are a lot of stories behind that, but we'll save them for later. There's a reason why. There really is.
So you basically go in, you turn on Jimmy Buffett, and then you kind of start the punch downs. The purpose of the punch down really is to break up that cap that you see, and essentially make sure that the juice is sort of well mixed, the yeast is sort of well mixed and fermenting sort of evenly across all of the fruit in the bin. The other great thing about doing these punch downs is you also, each time you punch down, you take measurements of temperature and bricks, which is sugar content, and then you taste, which is the most fun part. And when you taste, you start to recognize how the fruit sort of, the juice, the grape juice converts to alcohol. You start to notice how that conversion varies day to day, varies from one bin to another. So you really start to, at least I really started to appreciate, how much variability and uniqueness there is to each part of the vineyard, all the fruit that goes in the bins, and how each bin is sort of is managed, and how it grows and develops over time. So that was sort of, I think sort of the standard thing that I did for all of the 2 weeks. And then there was like a whole, just a bunch of other odds and ends. A lot of it was, I joked where, I used to say, 80% of winemaking appears to be cleaning stuff and moving stuff around. And a lot of it is sort of planning and measurement and making sure that, we're planning, a few steps ahead as we're executing, in the middle of harvest, which is an insanely busy time. And then I actually came back.
What are you doing in this picture? You should tell them.
I think I'm measuring the amount of wine that's actually in the tank. So, opening the top, and Carrie's handing me like a tape measure to measure sort of how far down from the top the wine is, so that we can sort of roughly calculate what the volume is in the tank. Is that right?
Yep. Which was wonderful, because he asked me how do you know how much wine is in the tank? And I said, well, we get to figure it out. And basically the timing was perfect. And basically what you do is, you know how big your tank is, and you measure your empty space, and then you calculate your empty space and how many gallons of wine that is. So the opposite, then you subtract from the total, that gives you how much wine you have. Because you can't, otherwise, how do you tell in a stainless steel cylinder how much volume you have? So it's kind of cool.
Yeah. And then, I did have a chance to come back in February of this year, to then help with the bottling of vintages from, I guess, 2 years ago. Although no, we did a couple from 2019 as well. But the coolest thing that I thought about the bottling was that you could fit an entire bottling line in the back of a semi. I've spent a lot of time, in bottling facilities for dairy, for whiskey and spirits and various other things. But this is the first time I've seen like a mobile bottling line, which was incredibly cool to see. So that was kind of all of the stuff that I did.
Okay. Question. Jim has a question for you.
Yep.
Well, Jim has a question. I want to see what your answer is, because the question is, should 2 bins containing grapes from adjacent locations in the vineyard produce wine that tastes the same?
2 bins.
Like, did bin 4 and 5 taste the same? Did bin 4 and 6 taste the same?
I think the short answer is no. I think there's so much variability, even from row to row. Even when we were tasting the fruit in each of the different bins, they, even though they were from sort of adjacent rows in the vineyard, they tasted incredibly different, even in the fermentation process. And I imagine that they still taste different now.
I think the really cool point about that is they taste different in fermentation. Sometimes they taste different in fermentation just because one's gotten a little ahead of the adjacent rows, and generally, yes, they're fairly similar. But the fun thing about doing this twice a day, every day, and then following the fruit through the vineyard, through fermentation, through the winemaking, watching those wines age over time, is you really get to know the nuance and the variation, and that's what makes site-specific wines so fascinating. And I think one of the cool things about what we do at Côte Bonneville is, with the Côte coming from the hillside and the carriage house coming from the lower planting, those are 50 yards apart at their closest place. The wines are completely different, and most wineries would blend those together and make Cabernet Merlot and then make varietals. But the cool thing about our wines are that nuance and variability is carried all the way through to the final consumer. So you get to taste some of that, not at the level of detail because we can't bottle everything in 1-ton fermenters. It would be insane. But that's what makes getting to know a vineyard and wine so much fun, because it is the nuance between this year and that year. And like Adrish was saying earlier, the 11 or the 12, they're the same rows in the vineyard. So, but the weather was different. I mean, they're made the same way. They're grown the same way. They're made the same way in the grand scheme of things. But that nuance and variability that we try to carry through all the way is really, I mean, that's what makes wine so much fun. Otherwise, it's just grape juice.
I think the fun part too, and Carrie sort of mentioned this too, is when you taste those fermenters and you taste that juice, because it is juice when it starts out and then it goes through the fermentation process. You're really tasting, all those things in winemaker notes where it's got, for instance, let's just Chardonnay, pineapple. Oh my God, it's so obvious when it's fruit. And as it becomes turning into wine, if you just taste it as wine, finished wine, unless you're a trained taster, it's training your taste buds to pick these things up and see how that character stays throughout the process into the finished process. Cherry is very predominant in our vineyard.
Chardonnay is a fun one though, because like one day it'll taste like pineapples, and then the next day it tastes like lemons, and the next day it tastes like something completely different. And Riesling's the same way, because it's like the fruit cup.
Yeah.
One day you'll get lime, the next day you get peaches, the next day we'll have 2 tanks that are exactly the same juice, and one tastes like peaches and one tastes like pears, and then 3 days later they've flipped, and it's so much fun. It's what makes harvest. I think it's one of the best parts about harvest. So, okay, bottling, go on. Sorry.
I think your dad's saying he's got to go or something.
No, he doesn't have to go yet.
Okay.
You want to talk, Dad? Oh, hand.
Oh.
Okay, if we go back to the picture of Adrish in the vineyard helping the pick, the one thing you'll notice above the trellis is the netting. And we net the whole vineyard because we have a big problem with birds in the surrounding orchards that love to come and feast. And so when it's time to pick, we're on the morning side of the vine. We lift the net up on the morning side and flip it up on top. So that's what you see above. Then the next thing, I have to give our ladies a huge pat on the back. Adrish alluded to this, that they pre-sort for our winery customers. They know what fruit tastes good. They know what not to pick. And so they will either leave it on the vine or put it on the ground, because as Adrish pointed out, if you don't have great tasting berries, you're not going to make great wine. And the ladies are very conscientious about that, and our customers deeply appreciate the extra effort that they do in the vineyard to get them beautiful fruit, even though they're going to put it across the sorting table. And many of them have gotten to the point where they say, if it's coming from the brewer, we don't need to put it across the sorting table. They've done a beautiful job in the vineyard for us.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. And that picture, by the way, was in the short rows, which is, if you'll remember from a previous happy hour, is where the Côte Bonneville comes from. right?
Short rows are the red label cab.
The
When
red label
it
cab.
comes- The red
So-
label cab. Normally, if it doesn't go into red label cab, it goes into coat. So
And
the
it was coat.
2019, that's going into the coat.
Yeah. So
But the
that was
reason
like,
I said bin 5 tastes different than 4 tastes different than 6 is because this was in bin 5 and this was Adrish's favorite bin.
yeah.
Yeah.
While
So
I was tasting. Yeah.
how long does it take for people who pick to know which to pick and which grapes to leave? Well, most of our ladies have worked with us for either multiple years. I'll let Dad answer. Go ahead, Dad.
So, yeah, we have an all-female crew except for the tractor drivers. And so these ladies are not just working in the fields and have years of experience in vineyards. And we will hire people who have experience in other vineyards, and they will say, okay, you do things differently, you're more stringent. But they cook at home. And so they know what's good. When you buy fresh fruit all year for your family, you know what's good and what's not. And so they're not just bringing their field experience, but they're also bringing their culinary backgrounds from home. And when they cook for us, you can tell they're fantastic cooks. And so it's a great combination to have in your picking crew people that are very careful about that.
Yeah. Kevin, we do have our own press. Adrish had a great, I don't know if you have any good pictures, but he has a great video, but I don't think video works really well with Zoom. But we have a basket press that holds about one of those fermentation bins. So we will ferment a ton of fruit at a time. And then when it's finished with fermentation, we drain the juice out and we take the skins and we pick them up we pick up the bin with the forklift and basically pour it out into the press. And so we pick one bin at a time, we press one bin at a time. And having everything sized that way does make more work, but it also means that when we get those really spectacular bins, like the short rows, we kept the short rows separate. And when Adrish came back in February, we tasted through everything, and it was interesting to see. That way, you can keep that differentiation. You can keep that variability separate, and having everything sized consistently across the vineyard. And a one-time press is pretty small, but it's important for us to, again, be able to capture all this nuance and all of these and really micromanage everything from the vineyard, not only in the vineyard, but also in the winery. So, okay. I think, Adrish, there were more questions in your presentation.
Oh, yes. So then, what you did. The next question is, well, did you learn anything? Thanks, Co, for that question. But before I answer that question, can I just say how awesome this picture is? I mean, you've got the comfortable leather chair, you've got the fancy like Persian rug or whatever that is. You've got, not only do you have a glass in your hand, you also have a tray to hold a glass that, I don't know, you're aerating or holding for once you're done with the current glass you're drinking. So if you guys haven't been to Co's tasting room, you should definitely check it out. It's a cool setup. So anyway, to answer your question, Co, so we've been talking a lot, actually right now, as well as in previous happy hours, about kind of what Côte Bonneville stands for, right? And I think I pulled this from your website, but it's really about making classically styled. I added the age-worthy, but we've all been talking about how age-worthy these wines are, wines that best express our spectacular site. And I think that's where all of this starts. So again, sort of going back to, well, what makes for a business to be successful? And I think a successful business starts with incredible clarity of vision about what it is we're trying to actually achieve. Because having that clear vision then essentially informs every choice you make through the growing and then the harvesting and then the winemaking process. And you guys have actually been talking about a lot of what I'm about to say already, which is great. Because, you know, in the vineyard, it's all of the choices you make about, you know, we've talked about bud break and shoot thinning. We've talked about nets. We've talked about irrigation. We've talked about canopy management. You know, all of these things are sort of managed differentially, you know, almost individual row by individual row, with the goal of how do we maximize the quality of the fruit that we are growing, because that's where it all starts. Then, you know, in the winemaking process, we already talked about, you know, how, you know, you use data, you measure, you react to what the data is telling you. So there were days where, you know, a bin was too warm, and yeast is happiest within a certain temperature range. So then you say, okay, well, let's put the bins outside of the winery, so they can cool down, or whatever. Like, I don't know that, you know, how the choices are made. I just saw the choices being made, right? But I think there's an incredible sort of this, you know, obsessive attention to like data and detail. It shows up in, you know, in that. It shows up in, you know, cleaning and sanitizing, sort of, you know, it shows up in the choices you make, as you guys are talking about, in terms of like, well, what size, why do we choose the size of the equipment we choose? Because it allows us a certain amount of flexibility and control over what we make and how we choose to make it. And then that sort of translates also. So it's like, you know, how do we grow the fruit? How do we make the liquid that goes into the bottle? But then how do we actually package it up? And, you know, that's just as important, right? Like making sure, I mean, even something as simple as making sure that the labels are perfectly aligned and the capsules go on perfectly well, and the screw caps are, you know, look good, and the corks look good, and everything. Like, all of that is like massive attention to detail, which ties back to what it is we're trying to achieve through our vision. And then I think the last thing, and Hugh, you started talking about this, is it is how incredibly valuable and important it is to have experienced, competent people to actually run all these processes, from the vineyard crew that we just talked about, to Bill Hamlin, who is, I mean, he's amazing. He runs the bottling line, and that's him in the hat in that picture. And then, I mean, you've got, I don't know, like, you've had like lots of consultants and so on, you know, also in the past, kind of help you, including Co. So it's, you know, it's like starting with the vision, having that clarity of vision, making sure everything you do, you know, to execute against that vision is sort of ties back to the vision, is of the highest quality. And then having the, you know, a group of people who are actually like really good at what they do. I think all of these, you put all of these together and you end up with an exceptional product, or products like the wines that you make. The last thing I will say is, in all of this, there is no question who the final sort of quality control arbiter is. Who would you say that is?
Yeah, that's the peanut gallery, not to us. Who?
So
Throw some comments out in the chat, guys. I want to know what you guys think.
Hands up.
Nope, you're not getting unmuted yet. Come on, we need some opinions in the chat. Maybe this is just to make sure you guys are listening. We got a vote for Mom. We got a vote for me. Okay. Dad, do you want to answer that, or do you want?
Kathy or Dad, Carrie, Kathy or Dad.
June, that's like all the above. That's cop out answer. Dad, before you answer, I'm going to let Adrish tell his story.
Oh.
Mike says, Mom.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of stories, but when I knew I had passed the quality test, right? So I was on the bottling line. My only job was to put the capsule, the sleeve that kind of goes on top of the cork bottle.
This part right here.
Yeah. And that was my only job. Think Charlie Chaplin, like modern times, right? But Kathy was so worried that I would screw it up somehow that she was like, all right, you do half, I'll do half. We had like 2 stations. And then I think it was about, I don't know, 15, 20, 30 minutes later, I can't remember what it was. She finally sort of walked away and started to monitor the labeling station and let me, sort of just take that over entirely. And I was like, wow, I have finally gotten the Kathy stamp of approval. So yeah, in terms of final QC, it's all Kathy all the time.
Okay, wait, now Dad, you can raise your hand. You're unmuted.
Okay. Well, Carrie does a fabulous job with the winemaking. There's no question. But as Adrish pointed out, Kathy's the boss.
Don't choke.
Such pressure.
That's why we have a good team that everybody's keeping an eye on quality. But still, yeah, you got to have.
You got to have a chief quality officer.
Yes, you do.
Um,
I will say what Adrish was saying and what we do and why we do it. And one of the questions I get asked a lot is, are you going to make more? Are you going to make more? Are you going to get bigger? How much bigger are you going to get? And I think he did a really good job of saying we had a vision, and we sized, we built our facility, we sized our equipment. We know the limits, our physical limits of what we can do ourselves. And the short answer is, it would be very hard to get, yes, we can make more wine. I mean, there's no question that we have, 45 acres under vine. If we chose to do all of that, we could be a very big winery and a very different winery. But we can't make the types of wines we make at a large scale, because it just is too difficult to keep all of these lots separate.
And you can't
to do all the handwork. It just,
even if you have a really big crew, or really, really fantastic crew. And like when I worked at Phelps, they have I would say of all the wineries I've ever worked at, aside from Côte Bonneville, Phelps has a very, very good crew. They do a good job of training their cellar hands. They know when you're in the cellar, you are the first. I mean, you're so much of the data you're measuring and monitoring. I mean, like Adrish said, we measure temperature, we measure bricks, but we also taste every morning and every afternoon. And when you're punching things down, you're smelling, and so much of the information you're gathering is sensory data. It's not numbers. And if your cellar crew isn't paying attention, if your cellar crew isn't communicating, you're losing. I don't care how good your numbers are, you're losing the most important information you have, because I mean, yeast nutritional status, which is critical, is all sensory. By the time it shows up in the numbers, it's too late. You've missed the boat. And those are the kinds of things that you have to have the hands on, you have to do it. To make exceptional wines at scale is hard, because there's so much more coordination, and everybody has to be operating at that level, which is a challenge. Micah?
Is there any technology that can do some of that sensory part?
Mm-mm. I mean, not really. Not really, and not at high throughput. So if you were gonna do things, I mean, you can kind of do GCMS testing and get numbers. You can do phenolics testing, and Co might actually have some better insight on some of these than we do, because he worked at a very research-oriented winery that was large enough to do those sorts of things. But the challenge also is, by the time you're big enough to be able to afford the GCMS, to be able to run some of that data or run those analyses, you already have fermentation tanks that are bigger than our entire production. So the trade-off for being able to do that means you already lose all of the nuance and variability that make it so that we can make Cabernet, for example. And I mean, this is one of those cases where it's winemaking at a large scale and winemaking at a small scale are very, very different kinds of winemaking. It's the same title, but it is not the same job. So.
And the big wineries can do a very good job putting out large quantities of wine at a pretty high quality standpoint for a price point. Do you have the interesting sense of place? Is it wine, or is it what we're trying to do? And what we try to do is very different, which is a very unique product. Very much speaks to the land it comes from. So it's not that that's a bad model. It's not our model.
It's how you get table wine. It's how you get really, really good table wines. Because if you take somebody who's 100,000 cases to gallo size, who has 1,000,000-gallon tanks, blending tanks, you can have some pretty bad grapes in there, you have some pretty good grapes in there, but you always get the average of everything. And one of the great things about technology is it enables you to raise your average, and having good grapes raises your averages, having good technology raises your averages. I think that's one of the reasons that Washington's larger producers are, I think, far and away above the other large producers at from other parts of the world, because we have good grapes and we have a pretty technology focused region. And so the average for Washington at those mass produced is really high, and the wines are they over deliver at the price point. If I'm going to spend less than $12 on a bottle of wine, especially if it comes from the US, it's coming from Washington, because I don't really like $6.99 wines from California, but I'll drink $6.99 wines from Washington because they are better. They're better than they should be, or they could be otherwise, because the grapes are better than $6.99 grapes that you get in California. And we have a lot of great technology that can make those really good. Like Co says, it is like cooking, so many variables and complexity. But I think the difference is, if you want special, you're never going to get special when it's an amalgamation of averages. Special is, by definition, celebrates the variability and the nuance and the difference, because you're looking for things that are exceptional, and you can't find them if you blend them in with everything else. I mean, I think that's one of the reasons Co left. I mean, Co, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but that's one of the reasons that you got all that wonderful training working at a larger winery, and then said you wanted to celebrate the really interesting, unique sites and the difference in the nuance and the variability, because at a certain point, I think Co agrees that that's what makes winemaking fun, I think.
The cooking analogy is funny because, like, they now have robots making pizzas, for example. They don't have robots making, like, complex variable dinners and stuff.
Mhm.
Oh, by the way, that company that makes that makes robot pizza, they're not around anymore.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
And there's our business expert. So Jim wants to know if the people with the experience needed to make sensory observations need the experience with your vineyard to put it to best use. And I say yes. It takes time. There's a certain amount of, whether you're growing grapes or making wine or doing anything, there's a certain amount of just fundamental base knowledge that when you have that, I mean, it's why people have consultants who have business knowledge. Like, having never worked in a winery, Adrish could come in and understand pretty quickly where the strengths and weaknesses of our operation are, because he understands how to evaluate a business. Does that mean that he knows how to make winemaking decisions? Nope. Does that mean, and then to give, so the more, but with any of it, I mean, this is why I got the graduate degree and worked in California, Australia, and Argentina before, in multiple places in California, and traveled around before I came home, because it's helpful to have that breadth, and it's helpful to have those basic fundamental skills. But that doesn't exclude the knowledge of the site. And I think that's one of the really cool things about, I think that's why it's so important to live in the Yakima Valley if you're going to make wines from the Yakima Valley, which, I mean, everybody in Washington does, but to be in the vineyard every day for 10 years, to be, in my case, longer for mom and dad, but to be in the vineyard every day for that long, to have worked with the fruit for that long, it's, the longer I do it, the more comfortable I am not doing all the lab work. Not, I mean, you have that combination of base knowledge and experience in that specific site that it's critical to, so many of these calls are based on judgment and intuition, and it takes education and experience to really do it well. So, oh good, we've got cooking going on the side. All right. Yes, we're good. We should let you keep going, Adrish.
Yeah, I'm just conscious of time, but I've got a couple more things that I thought I could.
Dad's got one thing to say, and then he's gonna. Do you have to go change water today, or you turned it off already?
No, so to reinforce what you're saying, the cool thing also is that every year in the vineyard is a different year. And so that's best exemplified by the difference between the 2011 and the 2012 carriage house that Adrish alluded to. 2011 was the coldest year on record. 2012 was middle of the fairway. The two wines taste dramatically different. They're beautifully made, and there was a huge amount of attention to detail in each of those years. 2011 presented a lot of problems, but they're very subtle and beautiful wines. And so the growing season adds an extra element of this year is different than the last, and it's going to be different than next year.
Okay, I'm muting him again. Go ahead, Adrish.
All right. So this is sort of like reflections on kind of the rural Côte Bonneville. Paul's not here, but he asked me to ask this question. He asked me this question anyways, like, fine, what else did you do? And so
Second, he said he was sorry to leave.
yeah. And so as I mentioned, initially, like, I'm just generally interested in food and food systems, and being, in Washington, in the Yakima Valley around harvest was really fun for a variety of reasons. I mean, you get to see harvest happening in a lot of different crops. This is the most pumpkins I've seen in one place at any point in time. Hop harvest happened a couple of weeks, I think, before I showed up, but that harvest in general is just like a super busy season all around, and there's a lot of activity in the Yakima Valley around then. And then, knowing that I've interested in this kind of stuff, Hugh and Carrie sort of, hooked me up with trips to two of the largest apple packing facilities at Washington Fruit and Allen Brothers, and that was incredibly cool to kind of get to see those operations again as sort of somebody who spent a lot of time in various manufacturing facilities and warehousing and so on. It was just like really, and I'd just come from California where they had a similar packing facility for like oranges and lemons, so to be able to see, to be able to compare and contrast was really cool. They had some really neat technology in there, including this optical sorter, which used like AI and machine learning and things like that to sort based on size, sort based on external appearance and blemishes, but then also was able to, I believe through infrared, actually identify internal blemishes and kind of sort apples out according to that, which was super cool to see. I think the other thing that's important here is, I think, we're all sort of recognizing that, sort of learning a lot about food supply chains actually as we go through COVID. And while I was in Sunnyside, I think we decided to pick a day earlier than planned. Like our last pick was a day earlier than planned because there was a frost that was supposed to come through. And so it sort of highlighted to me kind of how variable farming is and how much you're at sort of the mercy of, if the fruit's ready to pick, it's ready to pick. And if, you're at the mercy of weather and things like that. And what happened was there was a whole bunch of apple orchards where they couldn't find the labor and equipment in time to pick before the frost came through. I think it was like 2 days of 15-degree like nights or something like that. And so when I came back in February of this year, it was eye-opening to see all of the apples that people weren't able to pick.
3 million bins.
3 million bins. Like, that's a lot of effort, time, energy, resources, money that's gone into growing something that you're not able to then do anything with. And in fact, you probably have to spend more time sort of, removing, the apples from the trees before you can, plan for the next year's harvest. So it just sort of highlights to me, the challenges in the food supply chain, and especially like, where, how hard and how challenging it is, especially at sort of that start of that supply chain, which is where our food comes from, which is in the farms where it's grown. But then,
It's good he asked that question before he started snoring under the desk.
And so first of all, I would say, Nugget, that everything that I've talked about so far was part of the fun. But in addition to that, I did have a ton of fun outside of sort of working in the vineyard and the winery and geeking out on food and food supply chains and things like that. Spent a lot of time eating great food and making great food and pairing it with great wines. Spent a lot of time with the assorted dogs in and around the vineyard. That juice did not make it back into the barrels, in case anybody's wondering. I got to carve my first pumpkins, which was really cool. And then, I got to go on what I think is now my favorite of the routes that I've ridden in Sunnyside. It's called Gravity Hill. Micah, the next time we're out there, we have to do this unless we already did. Um, uh, and then what else did I do? Oh, and then I got to be a tourist in Sunnyside, which was like really, really fun. So there's like a whole bunch of things around Sunnyside that are cool, but you can also do in about a day or a half a day. So the picture on the top right is the inside of Ben Snipes' original cabin, and Carrie, maybe you can talk about that. And then there's a whole bunch of bronze sculptures scattered around Sunnyside, which were also just really cool to check out.
Yeah, Ben Snipes' cabin, which is right across the way from Coe's Winery and Tasting Room, is the original. It's one of this area was settled by Ben Snipes when he came in and was moving cattle through. And so one of the cabin, his original cabin from the late 1800s is set up on display as it would have been when somebody lived there. And it's,
yeah, there's a cool book called, I think it's Ben Snipes' Northwest Cattle King, and it's by a local historian, kind of pretty cool. So Sunnyside has a lot of what's called bunchgrass, and bunchgrass cattle really like that. So he drove cattle through Sunnyside and then up into Canada, across the Columbia River and up north to Canada for sale. So anyways, it's an interesting, that's basically who settled this area, was cattleman, and he was one of the famous ones. The cow on the bottom is milking the cow, and that's kind of what they call morning chores. So it's kind of a heritage back to the kids around here kind of grew up in the agricultural community and partake in a lot of the farms operations, and that's milking the cow. And of course we have our astronauts, so we have the Bonnie Dunbar story too, which is pretty cool, bronze. So it's kind of fun.
yeah.
And yes, Sasha does like wine. She is not a beer drinker like Nugget.
That's grape juice, but no, she loves her grape juice. So
yeah,
that's in the blender. It's a lab experiment. So yes, they never go back into the bins, but especially not after the dogs have been in them. Then they don't go back into them.
No. And down at the bottom are some really great Indian food that Adrish made. And like I said, we had a lot of fun in those beets and potatoes and carrots, that red. Oh my goodness, that was delicious. And
yeah,
so
we'll be sending out, because we're doing appetizers now with the happy hours. We will probably feature one of the curry recipes with the in the wine club, with the recipes we send out in the wine club. And no, we don't teach the dogs sensory. The reason we don't teach the dogs sensory is because I'm trying to teach the dogs not to eat the grapes and not to drink the wine, because yeah, I have this phenomenal photo of Nugget up the Riesling, especially the way the vines grow. There's a little more sprawl, the fruit's a little bit lower. And we were up walking in the Riesling probably 2 years ago, and I have this, and Nugget, I turn around and Nugget is sitting there eating the grapes, just standing there. I mean, he's not little, but he's standing there at eye level, just nom, 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 eating the grapes. And I looked at him like, Nugget, you can't do that. And he's got the guiltiest look on his face, like, you caught me, whoops, eating the grapes off the vines. I finally taught him, because the crew picks the grapes into 5-gallon buckets. I finally taught him you cannot eat the grapes out of the 5-gallon buckets, because that's counterproductive.
yeah.
So we are not working with them on their sensory for that reason. So, but yeah, we're glad you had fun as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, that was it. I mean, I think I mean, to me, it was an awesome 2 weeks. So thank you to all of you for hosting me, but also like putting up with all of my stupid questions and general sort of, incompetence around the winery and vineyard. But it was like, it was a really cool learning experience. And then, hopefully, at some point, we'll get back to the tasting room, back to the train station later on at some point this year.
Yep.
Looking forward to that. So yeah, we're hoping, I mean, it sounds like we'll be opening up soon and able to do the progressive dinner in July. And then we will do the, again, hoping to do the Syrah release, or the used to be Syrah release, now the pre-harvest party in August. So fingers crossed. And the more of this that we can do in the vineyard.
Hey, Cheryl, I think you're wearing the same outfit.
It's not. That's short sleeve. This is long sleeve.
That's what happens. There's a lot of camouflage in this house.
I think she was wearing camo in the previous picture that she was.
I wear a lot of camo. That's short sleeve. This is long sleeve. This is actually green. That's black and gray.
She likes one in every style and every color.
Hey, but way to notice, Adrish.
Yeah. Thumbs up.
All right, so at our next event, we expect to see Cheryl in a different camo.
Not far-fetched.
Because, as we all know, Cheryl really doesn't like to shop. And never.
I don't like to shop as much as I like to drink wine.
Shopping for wine, that's the win. So, all right. Do we have any other questions for Adrish while we've got him on the line? Or it sounds like, I mean, everybody did a good job of asking as we were going.
How are you cutting your hair?
How do I what?
How are you cutting your hair now?
As you can tell, I basically, this is the COVID haircut. This is called hashtag. All right. I've got a trimmer, and I run my trimmer about once every 3 days. Easy peasy.
Oh, ouch.
The alternative is you end up with long, like me. So,
which would not be a good look for me.
All right, well, next week, guys, we've got Andrea Johnson, who took the photos that, she didn't take the photos of Côte Bonneville that are on the far wall in this picture, but she did take the picture of Max and I on the wall, and she took she's taken a lot of the photos. She's also a Northwestern alum, which is, all the cool kids are apparently. And,
but she's like the preeminent wine vineyard photographer in the world.
In the Northwest.
Well,
I don't know about the world, but she does a lot of work in the Pacific Northwest. She has done a lot of work in New Zealand. She guides trips around the world to the Himalayas, and she actually just came back from, she was still in Patagonia when we had gotten locked down for COVID. So she had an interesting experience getting back to the US from the middle of nowhere. And she's a fantastic person. So we look forward to talking with her next week, and we'll see you guys all next week.
And maybe tomorrow for,
oh yeah, tomorrow, Marshall, we should now's your chance. I'm unmuting you. Tell us what you're going to do tomorrow.
Yeah, so I hope all you guys are going to join in. It's going to be really fun. We're going to do a little virtual tour of Red Mountain. I hope to show you guys a lot about the Red Mountain AVA, not just the Shaw Vineyards, but the whole AVA, and then kind of dive into Quintessence Vineyard to show you some of the things that we do, some of the technical things that we're doing just to produce these high quality grapes. I think it'll be lots of fun.
Well, and Micah, to your question, I think there were your questions about mechanizing and technology, and because Marshall grows more grapes than we do, he's got a lot more toys, and so you'll have fun tomorrow. You should tune in.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, and I just like plug for Marshall as well. I spent some, thanks for the tour when I was out there, I don't know, in August of last year, and I learned how I learned the most important thing about farming, which is how to lean against a truck and talk to people.
Well, because if all winemakers do. So in that, I was so excited when I realized that this is winemaking, right? Like you're walking through the vineyard, swirling, nice. You're walking through the vineyard, swirling and sipping
nice.
wine while you're strolling through the vines. That's winemaking. That picture right there, that's farming.
Yeah.
Stand on the back of it, leaning on a truck, talking to people.
Oh, that's great. That's great, Adrish.
So, all right, guys. Well, we will see you all tomorrow or next week. And if you miss these, we're posting everything on YouTube afterwards. So head over and subscribe to the YouTube channel. Make sure you catch all of both the Yakima Valley Vineyard tours that we've been doing and the Côte Bonneville happy hours. Yeah, who are we? I don't know. Oh, and I'm also doing, just for fun, because I'm doing tastings now. My Tuesday tastings, which are like a minute on Tuesdays at 5 and Fridays at noon. We're following that cab vine, the adjacent vine. Actually, we're going through and following that every minute. So it's another way to follow the vineyard, which is super fun. So thanks for joining us. Thanks, Adrish, and we'll see you all next week. Cheers.
Cheers.